An unassuming little girl stood beside her father, dwarfed by the imposing steel and concrete architecture of the nation's most elite firing range. She wore simple jeans and a faded pink t-shirt, a stark contrast to the hardened Navy SEALs who moved with lethal grace around her. To their left, General Theron, a man carved from granite and arrogance, laughed dismissively at her father's quiet request. The general, his chest a billboard of military achievement, saw only a child who had wandered out of a playground and into a world she could not possibly comprehend. He gestured condescendingly toward the exit, his voice dripping with patronizing authority. What he didn't know, what no one in that high-stakes facility could have possibly guessed, was that the little girl was about to shatter their entire understanding of skill and possibility. He never saw it coming, and what happened next would not only leave everyone speechless, but would redefine the very standards of a Navy SEAL. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. The air inside the West Coast Special Warfare Training Facility tasted of discipline. It was a sterile, metallic tang, mixed with the faint, sharp scent of cordite and gun oil, a perfume for the nation's most lethal warriors. Every surface gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, from the polished concrete floors to the matte black steel of the target retrieval systems. This was a cathedral of precision, a place where legends were forged and tested in fire and noise. The silence between volleys was heavy, profound, filled with the weight of expectation and the ghosts of countless drills. It was into this hallowed quiet that 10-year-old Maya and her father, John, had walked. John, a man whose quiet demeanor and simple, worn field jacket belied a past written in the very foundations of this place, held his daughter's hand gently. Maya, for her part, was a portrait of calm curiosity. Her wide, observant eyes took in everything, from the intricate workings of the sound-dampening panels on the walls to the focused intensity in the eyes of the operators in the adjacent lanes. She didn't fidget or shrink away from the occasional deafening crack of a rifle. Instead, she seemed to absorb the energy of the room, her small chest rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm. Her presence was an anomaly, a splash of soft color in a world of olive drab and black steel, and it did not go unnoticed. The few operators who weren't downrange cast sidelong, questioning glances, their brows furrowing in confusion. Children were not simply uncommon here, they were non-existent. This was a sanctuary for the sharpest edge of the military machine, a place where the slightest distraction could have catastrophic consequences. Every person present had earned their right to be there through years of unimaginable hardship and sacrifice. The sight of a little girl in a pink t-shirt was so out of place it felt like a tear in the fabric of their reality, a strange and unsettling dream. Yet, she stood there, her small hand in her father's, radiating a sense of belonging that defied all logic, her gaze fixed on the distant targets with an unnerving analytical focus. General Theron moved through the facility not like a visitor, but like a monument surveying his own creation. He was a man of immense physical presence, tall and broad-shouldered, his crisp, decorated uniform a testament to a life spent in the rigid hierarchy of command. His silver hair was cut to regulation shortness, and his face seemed permanently set in a look of stern appraisal. He saw the world in terms of threats, assets, and acceptable losses. As he made his rounds, his voice was a low baritone that cut through the low hum of the ventilation systems, issuing clipped, precise commands to the sycophantic officers who trailed in his wake. He paused to inspect the grip of a young SEAL, his fingers adjusting the man's hold on a new model of pistol with an air of absolute authority. "Control the recoil before it happens, sailor," he stated, his words a decree, not a suggestion. He straightened a framed photograph on the wall, a picture of a past graduating class, his reflection momentarily appearing alongside the faces of the elite. To General Theron, standards were not merely guidelines, they were the sacred texts of his faith, and appearance was the first and most important testament. He believed you could measure a soldier's worth by the shine on his boots and the sharpness of his salute. Anything less than perfection was a sign of weakness, a crack in the armor that could jeopardize the entire unit. When his cold, assessing eyes finally fell upon Maya and John, they narrowed almost imperceptibly. He saw a civilian in a worn-out jacket and a little girl, who was the living embodiment of everything this place was not: soft, vulnerable, and utterly out of place. His lip curled in a faint, almost imperceptible sneer. He changed his trajectory, striding towards them with the purposeful gait of a man about to correct a grievous error, his entourage of junior officers scrambling to keep pace behind him. The silent, ordered world of the firing range was about to be disturbed, not by the report of a rifle, but by the crushing weight of one man's unassailable arrogance. The general came to a halt a few feet from them, his polished black boots seeming to suck the light from the floor. He deliberately ignored John, his entire focus, a beacon of condescending authority, lasering in on Maya. "Are you lost, little one?" he asked, his voice syrupy sweet, a tone one might use for a toddler who had wandered away from her mother in a grocery store. It was a performance, and every soldier on the range was his audience. He was making a point that this was his domain, and he was the sole arbiter of who belonged. Maya looked up at the towering figure, her expression unreadable. She did not cower or blush. She simply met his gaze with her steady, unnervingly calm eyes. "No, sir," she replied, her voice clear and soft, yet carrying an unexpected firmness that seemed to momentarily surprise the general. John placed a reassuring hand on his daughter's shoulder. "General Theron," he said, his voice quiet but respectful. "I'm John. This is my daughter, Maya. I was hoping she might be allowed to use one of the lanes." The general finally deigned to look at John, his eyes raking over the man's simple attire with blatant disdain. He saw no uniform, no insignia of rank, nothing that demanded his respect. He saw a nobody. He let out a short, sharp laugh that was less an expression of humor and more a weapon of dismissal. "A lane?" he repeated, turning his head slightly to share the absurdity with his accompanying officers, who dutifully offered faint, sycophantic smiles. "Son, this is the Naval Special Warfare Advanced Training Command. We forge warfighters here, not entertain children at a county fair. This is for a certain class of people." The insult was layered, aimed not just at Maya's age, but at John's perceived civilian status, his class. The air crackled with tension. The other shooters in the nearby lanes had paused their drills, their attention drawn to the unfolding drama. They were silent witnesses to the public dressing down, their faces impassive masks of military discipline. One of the younger men, a corporal named Evans who was supervising the ammunition counter, felt a knot of discomfort tighten in his stomach. He had seen John and Maya enter earlier, and while he too had been surprised, he had offered them a polite nod. There was something in the father's eyes, a quiet confidence that reminded him of some of the legendary instructors he'd only ever heard stories about. Evans watched now as General Theron puffed out his chest, reveling in his position of power. "People like you don't seem to understand what we do here," the general continued, his voice rising, becoming a lecture for the entire room. "This isn't a game. Every piece of equipment in this facility, from the rifles to the very targets themselves, costs more than your car. It's designed for professionals, by professionals." He gestured vaguely at Maya. "She can't even hold one of these weapons properly. She'd probably be frightened by the noise." The humiliation was methodical, deliberate, designed to strip them of any dignity. He was making an example of them, a warning to any who might forget the rigid order of his world. John's expression remained placid, a sea of calm against the general's storm of arrogance. He had anticipated this, had known that a man like Theron saw the world only through the narrow lens of his own ego. He held his ground, his hand never leaving his daughter's shoulder, a silent, unmovable anchor. Maya, in turn, took a slow, deep breath, a technique her father had taught her long ago. She didn't look at the sneering general or the watching soldiers. Instead, her gaze drifted back to the furthest target, a small black silhouette almost 100 yards away. In her mind, she was already there. She pictured the trajectory, calculated the imperceptible dip of the bullet over the distance, and felt the familiar, reassuring weight of a rifle stock against her cheek. The general's words were just noise, meaningless static in the face of the perfect, beautiful mathematics of the shot. Her silence, her utter lack of fear or intimidation, seemed to needle the general more than any argument could have. It was a quiet defiance he couldn't comprehend. The confrontation escalated. General Theron, irritated by their refusal to be properly cowed, took another step forward, invading their personal space. "Look, I don't know who you think you are, waltzing in here," he said, his voice losing its patronizing sweetness and taking on a hard, menacing edge. "But you are disrupting the training of the United States Navy's most elite unit. I am ordering you to take your daughter and leave. Now." He pointed a rigid, authoritative finger towards the exit. Around them, the atmosphere had grown thick with unspoken judgment. Most of the SEALs, indoctrinated by the same rigid culture as the general, sided with him. They saw an interruption, a civilian who didn't respect the sanctity of their space. Their glares were cold and sharp. The man was right. This was no place for a little girl. They murmured to one another, their words low, but their meaning clear. The father was irresponsible, arrogant even, to think he could bring a child here. John finally spoke again, his voice still infuriatingly calm. "General, with all due respect, we won't be in anyone's way. I will personally supervise her. She is prepared to make a purchase of the ammunition and rent the lane time, if that's the concern." This offer of payment was the final insult to Theron. "A purchase?" The general spat out the word as if it were poison. He laughed again, louder this time, a grating, ugly sound. "You think this is a commercial enterprise? A tourist attraction? This is about qualification, not cash. Your money is worthless here. Your daughter is not qualified. You are not qualified." He turned to one of his aides. "Captain, escort these guests from the premises and have security review the sign-in protocols. I want to know how this was allowed to happen." The captain, a man with a face as severe as the general's, stepped forward. "Sir, right away." He started to move toward John and Maya, his expression one of grim duty. The public humiliation was complete. They were being kicked out, officially and shamefully, in front of the very warriors Maya had so admired. It was a crushing display of power based on nothing more than prejudice and snap judgment. Just as the captain was about to place a hand on John's arm, John spoke one final time, his voice rising just enough to cut through the tension and stop the captain in his tracks. "General Theron," he said, his tone shifting, losing its respectful deference and gaining a new, hard authority. "My name is John Croft. I was the lead instructor and course designer for the Advanced Close Quarters Combat and Extreme Long-Range Marksmanship programs at this very facility for 12 years, from 2001 to 2013. The very protocols you are enforcing and the training drills your men are running right now, I wrote them." A wave of shock rippled through the room. The murmuring stopped instantly. The SEAL's expressions shifted from derision to disbelief. John Croft was not just a name, he was a legend. A ghost from the institution's golden age, a man spoken of in tones of reverence. They had all studied his manuals, his tactical philosophies. He was the architect of the modern SEAL operator. The general's smug expression faltered, his face slackening as he tried to process the information. He stared at John, really seeing him for the first time, trying to reconcile the man in the worn jacket with the legendary figure from the service records. "Croft?" he stammered, the name foreign and unbelievable on his tongue. Corporal Evans at the counter felt a jolt of vindication. He knew it. He knew there was something about the man. The captain who had been about to escort them out froze, his hand hovering awkwardly in the air. He looked back and forth between John and the suddenly pale general, his military certainty evaporating in an instant. The power dynamic in the room had just been hit by a tectonic shift, and the epicenter was the quiet, unassuming man who had just been dismissed as a nobody. The entire room held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. John let the weight of his name settle in the room before continuing. He wasn't angry. His voice remained level, almost educational in its tone, as if he were back in a classroom, explaining a complex concept to a new recruit. "I'm not here to trade on my past, General," he said, his eyes locking with Theron's. "I'm here because my daughter, Maya, asked to come. And in my experience, talent doesn't care about age, or gender, or what someone is wearing. It only cares about opportunity." He then looked down at his daughter, his expression softening. "She has demonstrated a level of skill that I believe, in the interest of national security and the advancement of our capabilities, you need to witness." The general was reeling. He was trapped. To refuse now, after publicly humiliating a man who was, in essence, institutional royalty, would be an act of such profound disrespect that it would have immediate career-ending repercussions. Every man in that room knew the name John Croft. To double down on his arrogance now would be suicide. His mind raced, searching for a way out, a way to save face. He could feel the eyes of his subordinates on him, their respect for him draining away with every second of his stunned silence. His entire platform of authority, built on reputation and an unblemished record, was crumbling beneath his feet. "All right, Croft," the general finally managed to say, his voice tight and strained. "Fine." He waved a dismissive hand toward the nearest empty lane, a state-of-the-art digital range. "The lane is yours, but this is on you. Any damages, any safety violations. It's all on you." It was a weak attempt to regain control, to frame it as a reluctant concession rather than a humiliating defeat. He turned to the other soldiers. "All right, show's over. Get back to your drills," he barked, but his words lacked their earlier conviction. No one looked away. No one was going back to their drills. The real show was just about to begin. Every single person on that range, from the newest recruit to the most seasoned veteran, was now completely fixated on the small girl in the pink t-shirt as she walked calmly toward the firing line. Corporal Evans, seeing his chance, hurried over from the ammunition counter, his expression one of eager helpfulness. "Mr. Croft, sir, it's an honor," he said, his voice filled with genuine awe. "What can I get for you and Maya?" John gave the young corporal a warm, appreciative smile. "Thank you, Corporal. Let's start with a standard SEAL sidearm, a Sig Sauer P226, and a full magazine." Evans nodded enthusiastically and rushed to retrieve the weapon and ammunition, handling them with a reverence usually reserved for holy relics. He presented the pistol to Maya, holding it flat on his palms. The weapon was large and heavy, a serious piece of military hardware that looked almost comically oversized in her small hands. General Theron watched from a safe distance, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, a smirk returning to his face. His shock had now morphed into a grim certainty that this would all end in predictable failure. The girl would barely be able to lift the weapon, let alone fire it accurately. He would be vindicated, and the legendary John Croft would be exposed as a fool. He leaned over to his aide and whispered, "Have the medics on standby. She's going to sprain her wrist." Maya ignored him. She took the pistol from Corporal Evans, her movements fluid and sure. Her father had taught her that every weapon had a spirit, a balance point, and she took a moment to find it. She expertly ejected the magazine, checked the chamber with a practiced motion that was second nature to her, and then reinserted the magazine with a solid, satisfying click. She gripped the pistol with both hands, her stance shifting into a perfect weaver, her shoulders square, her elbows slightly bent, her body a stable, solid platform. It was the exact stance from page 72 of the official SEAL training manual, the one John Croft had written. She raised the weapon, sighting down the barrel at the target 50 yards away, far beyond the standard distance for pistol qualification. The room was so quiet that the hum of the lights seemed deafening. Maya took one final calming breath, just as her father had taught her. The world narrowed until there was only her, the pistol, and the distant black silhouette of the target. She exhaled slowly, and in the quiet space at the end of that breath, she squeezed the trigger. The crack of the 9mm round was sharp and clean, a single definitive sound that echoed through the cavernous room. Almost simultaneously, a small, bright light appeared on the digital display screen above the lane. It was a perfect bullseye, dead center. A wave of murmurs rippled through the assembled soldiers. A single perfect shot could be luck, a fluke. General Theron's smirk remained frozen on his face, though a flicker of surprise registered in his eyes. Before anyone could fully process the first shot, Maya fired again, and again, and again. It was a rhythmic, controlled sequence. Crack, ping, crack, ping, crack, ping. She fired 10 shots in just under 15 seconds, a blistering pace for even a seasoned operator. On the screen above, 10 brilliant lights formed a single, tight cluster, all within the center ring of the target. The grouping was impossibly small, no larger than a silver dollar. It wasn't just a perfect score. It was a mechanically perfect score, a display of consistency and control that bordered on inhuman. The murmuring among the SEALs died away, replaced by a stunned, disbelieving silence. They stared at the screen, then at the little girl, then back at the screen. Their brains struggled to reconcile what their eyes were seeing. They had spent years of their lives, thousands of hours on ranges just like this one, trying to achieve a fraction of the effortless precision they had just witnessed. Corporal Evans stood with his mouth agape, his eyes wide. He had seen the best of the best shoot, but he had never seen anything like this. John Croft remained impassive, but a small, proud smile touched the corners of his lips. He knew. He had always known. The general's face had lost all its color. The smug, condescending mask had shattered, replaced by a look of stark, slack-jawed astonishment. His eyes were wide, fixed on the tight grouping of lights on the monitor as if it were an apparition. He took an involuntary step forward, his mind refusing to accept the data his senses were providing. It was impossible. He knew the parameters, the physics, the human limitations. What he had just seen defied all of them. "Reload," he commanded, his voice a hoarse croak. He needed to see it again. He needed to prove it was a trick of the light, a malfunction in the digital scoring system. Corporal Evans, snapping out of his trance, fumbled for another magazine and handed it to Maya. She took it without a word, her movements just as economical and precise as before. She dropped the empty magazine, slapped the new one home, and raised the pistol again, all in one seamless motion. This time, she didn't just aim at the center mass. She began a new drill, one of her father's own design, known as the Zodiac clock. She fired 12 shots, each one precisely placed at a different number on the clock face of the target, starting at the 12 o'clock position and moving clockwise. Ping, 1 o'clock. Ping, 2 o'clock. Ping, 3 o'clock. Each shot landed with surgical accuracy. It was a display not just of marksmanship, but of absolute mastery, of a connection between mind, body, and weapon that was almost mystical. The SEALs watched in complete awe. They were no longer soldiers watching a child. They were students watching a master. They began to point and whisper, not with derision, but with a new, profound respect. "Did you see that?" One breathed. "The recoil doesn't even move her." Another whispered back, "Her trigger discipline. It's perfect." The general looked as if he had been physically struck. The foundation of his worldview, the rigid belief that strength came in a specific, uniformed package, had been pulverized. He was witnessing a prodigy, a generational talent, and he had not only failed to recognize it, he had actively mocked and tried to expel it from his presence. "That's enough with the sidearm," John's voice cut through the stunned silence. He stepped forward and took the P226 from Maya's hands, giving her shoulder a proud squeeze. "Corporal," he said, turning to the still gaping Evans, "let's try a rifle. The Mark 18 carbine, if you please, standard configuration." Evans practically sprinted to the rifle rack. The Mark 18 was the workhorse of the SEALs, a short-barreled rifle designed for close-quarters battle, but lethal at medium range. It was a weapon every man in that room had staked his life on at one point or another. Evans returned with the rifle and 3 magazines, setting them down on the bench in front of Maya. The rifle was nearly as tall as she was. General Theron watched, a cold dread seeping into his bones. He felt a desperate, foolish hope that the heavier, more powerful weapon would finally prove to be too much for her. The kick from a 5.56 round was substantial. Surely she couldn't handle that. Maya said nothing. She simply picked up the weapon, her small frame seeming to disappear behind it. But the way she held it was anything but childish. She checked the weapon's action, adjusted the stock to fit her shoulder, and rested the barrel on the forward support. Her movements were imbued with a deep, instinctual familiarity. She looked through the holographic sight, her eye perfectly aligned. "Targets at 200 yards, John instructed calmly. At the far end of the range, new targets snapped into place, much smaller and more distant. Running the Scrambler drill. The Scrambler was one of Croft's most infamous creations. A series of 10 targets would pop up in a random, unpredictable sequence, each visible for only 1.5 seconds. Passing the drill required a score of 7 hits. The all-time record at the facility, held by a legendary SEAL sniper, was 9. No one had ever cleaned it. "Begin," John said. Instantly, a target popped up on the far right. Before it could even fully extend, Maya's rifle cracked, and the target vanished. Another appeared on the left. Crack. It too was gone. Her body was a study in fluid motion, her torso pivoting smoothly from the hips as she acquired and neutralized each target with lightning speed and chilling efficiency. The rhythmic reports of the rifle filled the air, a deadly drumbeat of perfection. Crack, crack, crack. She moved through the first 5 targets in under 4 seconds. The SEALs were no longer just watching. They were analyzing, their expert eyes breaking down her technique. They saw how she managed the recoil, letting the weapon flow with her body, not fighting against it. They saw the way her eyes darted between targets, her brain processing the random sequence faster than their own trained minds could follow. They were witnessing a level of neuromuscular coordination that was off the charts. The general had his hands on his knees, leaning forward as if trying to will her to miss. His face was slick with a sheen of sweat. This was no longer just a humiliation. It was an indictment of his entire philosophy. He had built his career on his ability to judge men, to identify strength and weakness on sight. That instinct, the very core of his command persona, was being systematically dismantled before his very eyes. The 6th, 7th, and 8th targets fell. She had now officially passed one of the most difficult close-quarters combat drills in the entire Special Forces arsenal. But she didn't slow down. The 9th target appeared in an awkward, far-left position. She swung the rifle, fired, and neutralized it, matching the facility's all-time record. A collective gasp went through the room. Then, the 10th and final target popped up. It was a trick shot, appearing for only a split second behind a simulated hostage target. Firing too quickly or with imperfect aim would mean hitting the hostage. It was a test of ultimate control. Without a moment's hesitation, Maya fired the 10th shot. The bullet passed cleanly through the narrow opening, and the final target disappeared. 10 for 10. A perfect score. She had not just broken the record, she had obliterated it. She lowered the rifle, placed it gently on the bench, and turned to look at her father, a small, quiet question in her eyes. It was the first time she had looked like a child since she'd stepped up to the line. A heavy, profound silence descended upon the firing range. It was a silence filled with awe, with shock, and with the deafening sound of paradigms being shattered. The digital scoreboard glowed with the impossible number, 10 out of 10. The time, 9.2 seconds. It was a record that might never be broken. Then, one of the SEALs, a grizzled master chief with scars on his knuckles and 2 decades of service in his eyes, began to clap. It was a slow, deliberate clap, a sound of pure, unadulterated professional respect. Another soldier joined him, then another, and another, until the entire room, filled with the hardest men in the United States military, erupted in a thundering ovation. They were not applauding a child. They were applauding a master of their own craft, a prodigy whose skill surpassed all of theirs. They were applauding the impossible made real. General Theron stood frozen in the center of the storm of applause, a statue of obsolescence. The sound washed over him, each clap a hammer blow against his pride. He looked at Maya, who was now quietly accepting a juice box from her father, and he felt a profound and terrifying sense of insignificance. His medals felt like cheap tin, his uniform like a costume. John Croft walked over to him, his expression unreadable. "General?" he said, his voice quiet, forcing Theron to lean in and listen, a subtle but clear reversal of their earlier dynamic. "Do you understand now? Do you see what you almost threw away?" The general could not speak. He could only nod, his throat tight, his eyes still fixed on the little girl who had just rewritten his entire world. The applause finally died down, but the energy in the room remained, charged and electric. The men looked at Maya with a kind of reverence, their earlier scorn replaced by an almost fearful respect. She had done more than just shoot well. She had revealed to them the flawed nature of their own judgment, and the humbling truth that the greatest strength can come from the most unexpected of places. John was not finished. He turned to Corporal Evans, who was still standing by, looking as though he had just witnessed a miracle. "One more, Corporal, if you don't mind. The Mark 13, a 30-06. We'd like to try the 1,000-yard lane." The request sent a fresh shockwave through the room. The Mark 13 was a dedicated sniper rifle, a heavy, powerful weapon designed for extreme long-range engagements. Firing it accurately at 1,000 yards was a skill that took even the most talented SEAL snipers years to master. The idea of a 10-year-old girl even attempting it was ludicrous. But no one was laughing now. The general, who looked like he had aged a decade in the last 10 minutes, simply shook his head in weary disbelief. He was beyond protesting. He was a passenger now, strapped into a ride he couldn't control. Corporal Evans, moving with the solemn purpose of an acolyte assisting in a sacred ritual, procured the rifle. It was a massive weapon, with a long, heavy barrel and a powerful telescopic sight. It looked less like a rifle and more like a piece of light artillery. 2 other soldiers helped Evans carry it and its heavy bipod to Maya's lane. They set it up for her, their movements careful and respectful, as if they were handling an unexploded bomb. Maya approached the weapon, her face a mask of intense concentration. She lay down on the mat behind it, her small body aligning with the stock. Her father adjusted the bipod for her and helped her settle in. "Wind is 3 knots, west to east," John murmured, more to himself than to her. "Slight updraft from the ventilation. Add 2 clicks of elevation." Maya reached up and made the microscopic adjustments to the scope's dials, her fingers moving with confident precision. She settled her eye to the scope, and the world disappeared, replaced by the magnified image of a target so far away it was barely a speck to the naked eye. She breathed, in and out. Her world became a tube, a straight line connecting her mind to a tiny point of impact 1,000 yards away. She lay there for what felt like an eternity, her body perfectly still. The only movement was the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of her back as she controlled her breathing. The rest of the range held its breath with her. The operators, the general, her father everyone was silent. Their collective attention focused on this single, small point of immense potential. They were no longer in a training facility, they were in a temple, and they were witnessing something sacred. Maya was not just aiming a rifle, she was communing with it. She was feeling the imperceptible vibrations of the building, sensing the subtle currents of air, processing 1,000 points of data into a single, intuitive act. Her father had taught her that long-range shooting was not about power. It was about listening. It was about listening to the wind, to the rifle, to the silence between your own heartbeats. And Maya was the best listener he had ever known. Finally, after a long, drawn-out moment of perfect stillness, she squeezed the trigger. The boom of the high-caliber sniper rifle was immense, a deep, resonant roar that vibrated through the floor and into the bones of everyone present. It was a sound of pure power. For a few agonizing seconds, nothing happened. The distance was so great that the bullet took time to travel. Then, on the giant monitor that showed a close-up of the 1,000-yard target, a single, brilliant light flashed. It was not just a hit, it was a cold-bore bullseye. A perfect shot with a cold rifle barrel, the single most difficult shot for any sniper to make. The room, which had been holding its collective breath, exhaled in a unified gasp of astonishment. It was a sound of disbelief giving way to pure wonder. Even John Croft, who had seen her do it 100 times before, felt a surge of overwhelming pride. He had known she was a genius, but to see it validated here, in the heart of the world that had once cast him out, was a vindication beyond words. General Theron sank onto a nearby bench. He put his head in his hands, not in anger or shame, but in a kind of profound, world-altering exhaustion. Everything he thought he knew, every metric by which he had measured strength and capability, had been rendered meaningless. He had built his world on a foundation of rigid, unshakable principles, and a 10-year-old girl had just leveled it with a handful of bullets. He looked up, his eyes finding John Croft, who was now helping Maya to her feet. The look on the general's face was no longer arrogant or angry. It was pleading. It was the look of a man who had become lost in his own territory and was asking for directions. The other SEALs swarmed the lane, not to crowd Maya, but to look at the sniper rifle, to look at the firing data on the screen, to touch some part of the history they had just witnessed. They spoke in hushed, reverent tones, dissecting the shots, the technique, the sheer impossibility of it all. They peppered John with questions, their professional curiosity overriding military decorum. "How did you teach her breathing control like that?" one asked. "What's her mental regimen?" asked another. "I've never seen anyone acquire targets that fast." John answered their questions patiently, but his eyes kept straying to the general. He knew that the real victory here was not the broken records or the adulation of the soldiers. It was the crack in the seemingly impenetrable wall of one man's prejudice. That was the target he had really been aiming for all along. Maya, seemingly oblivious to the storm of commotion she had created, was simply happy to have made her father proud. She took his hand, her small fingers wrapping around his. "Can we get ice cream now?" she asked, her voice a small, innocent whisper. The question, so profoundly normal and childish, was the final, perfect counterpoint to the extraordinary events of the day. It was a reminder that this incredible, prodigious talent was housed in the heart of a little girl who still wanted a simple treat after a long day's work. Suddenly, a new figure appeared at the main entrance of the range, a man in a sharp, dark suit, flanked by two uniformed naval officers. He radiated an aura of quiet, serious authority that was different from the general's blustering command. He was Admiral Harrison, the commander of Naval Special Warfare Command and General Theron's direct superior. His arrival was unannounced and, for the general, catastrophically timed. The admiral's sharp eyes surveyed the scene, the crowd of animated seals around a firing lane, the shell-shocked expression on General Theron's face, and the small girl holding the hand of a man in a worn field jacket. "What in the world is going on here, General?" Admiral Harrison's voice was calm, but it carried an undeniable weight that cut through the chatter in the room, bringing an immediate silence. "I was on my way to your office for our scheduled brief when my aide received a dozen text messages from men on this range, telling me I needed to get down here and see something unbelievable." He walked slowly toward the center of the room, his gaze missing nothing. General Theron scrambled to his feet, his face paling even further. He snapped to attention, a desperate attempt to reclaim some shred of his authority. "Admiral! Sir! This is an unscheduled civilian demonstration," he stammered, his words clumsy and hollow. Admiral Harrison's eyes finally landed on John Croft. A slow smile of recognition spread across his face. "John? John Croft? Is that really you? I'll be damned. I heard you'd fallen off the face of the earth." He walked past the general and extended a hand to John, shaking it warmly. "It's good to see you, Bill," John replied, using the admiral's first name. "It's been a while." The sight of the head of all naval special warfare greeting the man he had just tried to throw out like a piece of trash was the final, crushing blow for General Theron. He stood there, ramrod straight, a silent, uniformed testament to his own colossal failure of judgment. Admiral Harrison turned his attention to Maya. He knelt down, so his eyes were level with hers, his expression kind and curious, utterly devoid of the condescension the general had shown. "And you must be Maya," he said, his voice gentle. "I've been hearing some incredible things about you in the last 5 minutes." He looked at the glowing scoreboard, which still displayed her perfect scores. He whistled softly, a low, impressed sound. "It seems the stories are true. That's some of the finest shooting I've ever seen, and I've seen it all." He then stood up and looked directly at General Theron. The warmth vanished from his expression, replaced by a cold, hard disappointment. "General," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. "My aide also forwarded me a message from Corporal Evans, describing the initial interaction you had with Mr. Croft and his daughter. An interaction in which you reportedly mocked them, insulted them, and tried to have them forcibly removed for not meeting your standards." The blood drained from the general's face. He opened his mouth to speak, to defend himself, but no words came out. He had been so thoroughly, so completely outmaneuvered and exposed. "We are in the business of finding and cultivating the most exceptional warfighting talent on the planet," the admiral continued, his voice a steel whip. "Our enemies are not going to show up in a tailored suit or a perfect uniform. They will come in all shapes and sizes. And talent, General, true, raw, undeniable talent, does the same. Your job is to recognize that talent, not to slam the door in its face because it doesn't fit your outdated prehistoric notions of what a warrior should look like. You didn't just fail today, General. You failed spectacularly in front of the very men you are supposed to be leading." The public dressing down was surgical, precise, and utterly devastating. The general who had built his career on humiliating others was now receiving his own lesson in public shame, not from a subordinate, but from the one man he could not defy. A year later, the West Coast Special Warfare Training Facility had a new wing. It wasn't made of concrete and steel, but of glass and light. It was called the Croft Initiative for Advanced Talent Identification. The program, now funded by a massive congressional grant, was dedicated to finding and nurturing prodigious skill, no matter its origin. It had outreach programs in STEM schools, competitive shooting clubs, and even esports leagues, searching for the unique cognitive and physical traits that defined an elite operator. And the man in charge of the entire program, the man who greeted every nervous young candidate with a warm, encouraging smile, was Theron. He was no longer a general. He had been allowed to retire quietly, his rank intact but his command stripped away. He now wore simple civilian clothes, a polo shirt and slacks. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet, hard-won humility. He had spent the last year working alongside John Croft, deconstructing his own prejudices and rebuilding his understanding of strength from the ground up. His new mission was not to enforce standards, but to find potential. He remembered the day he first met Maya, not with shame anymore, but as the single most important educational experience of his life. He had been the arrogant gatekeeper, and she had been the key he had refused to see. Now, he spent his days making sure that no other key would ever be overlooked again. Maya, for her part, would occasionally visit the facility with her father. She was a living legend there, a quiet, smiling reminder to every operator that the most powerful force in the world was unlocked potential. She would still put on demonstrations that left the new recruits speechless, but she was more interested in the facility's new flight simulator program. Her talent was not limited to shooting. It was a genius for systems, for physics, for finding the perfect, elegant solution to any problem. The story of the little girl who broke every SEAL record had become a foundational myth for a new generation of warriors. It was a parable about the danger of judging by appearances, a lesson taught not in a classroom but on a firing range. And it served as a permanent reminder to look beyond the uniform, beyond the rank, and beyond your own biases, for you never know where you will find true greatness. What does a hero look like? Where does true strength come from? If you've ever been underestimated, you know the answer. It comes from within.